Welcome to the Landmark Theater's Q&A podcast. In this podcast, you will hear a discussion with Annie Clark and Andrea Pino from the film The Hunting Ground, moderated by Deputy Executive Director of ACLU Southern California, James Gilliam. Recorded at the Landmark West LA.
Thank you for being here. And we know that the audience, almost everyone stayed. We know you're eager to ask questions, but we were just talking a little bit outside, and I wanted to make sure that they had an opportunity to talk a little bit about what made them participate in the film, but also get a chance to talk about their organization.
We run an organization called End Rape on Campus that actually helps survivors file federal complaints and also helps them organize on campus. So that's our project, and that's what we've been working on for the past 2 years, along with Sophie Karasek, who's somewhere, I don't know where she went. Over there, Sophie, who was also in the film.
Yeah, so our project is called, as Andrea said, End Rape on Campus. It's Iraq. And basically we take direct service calls from survivors, from parents, from families, and it's never really a cookie-cutter approach. Some people want to file a complaint and know what that means. Some people were just listening to their stories for the first time and just saying, I believe you, and listening. And other times we refer to pro bono lawyers, pro bono therapists, and also work with state legislators, and federal legislators. So it's sort of an all-encompassing organization, and we can tell you more about that if you have specific questions.
Is it a national scope? Is it a nationally scoped organization?
Yeah, we're based in LA, but we have consultants all across the country, so it's national for sure.
Great. So our audience member has asked, she has two daughters that will soon be entering college, and she's asking what advice the panelists may give her as a parent for herself and for her daughters.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And again, thank you everyone for coming. I would say definitely ask the hard questions, and it's something that I encourage parents to ask when they even go on college tours. Ask them how they deal with sexual assault and not why their number, ask them why the numbers are low if they are. We've seen that a lot of schools have 0 reported across the board, and that should be a very big red flag. And I think it's something that I remember when my parents were going through the safety presentation, 5 years ago, and it was very much blue lights and rape whistles and hang out with your buddies, and that should also be just a big array of red flags. And I think, what we saw pretty quickly in coming forward is that there isn't a big community holding the school accountable. Oftentimes it's those that are currently dealing with overcoming assault. And it should be up to parents and it should be up to alumni, to continue asking those hard questions.
Yeah, and I'll just jump on what Andrea said. I would make sure all students know what their rights are. You have the right to a safe education. And to feel safe on your campus, and making sure that they know what their rights are. But also, at orientation, it shouldn't be a safety talk to primarily females about lock your doors and use the buddy system. We should be really talking to young men, even before they get in college, about, how to treat women, how to respect people. And thank you. I think we really need to flip the frame from teaching women how not to get raped to telling men, do not rape, and if you do, there is a consequence. And I think we need to hold our institutions accountable, because as you saw in the film, more students are expelled from cheating, than they are for sexual assault. And that's just unacceptable. So as a parent, I think you need to, like Andrea said, ask those tough questions at orientation. And if something happens, make sure your students know their rights.
And certainly parents' voices are very strong. You all have an amazing power at the school level, whether you know that or not. We find that sometimes the parents can get much more accomplished, and even just threatening bringing the ACLU, but without us needing to be there, parents can get a lot done. You have loud voices. So the audience question is about a bipartisan bill that's going forward, and it sounds like there's been a restriction placed on the amount of the liability that can be imposed on a school of around $150,000. I am not familiar with that, and are either of you prepared to address that?
Yeah, so we actually just came back from that literally yesterday. So at least the last draft I saw, it was 150 per Clery violation. So the Clery Act and Title IX are two separate laws, and the way it currently is right now with the Clery Act, it's only 35,000 per violation. So now it'll be 150,000 per violation. Now for Title IX, it could be up to 1% of the operating budget. So they're actually separate. I mean, at least the last draft I saw. I don't know if a Republican senator decided to change it, which happens.
Does that? Yeah. When you have bipartisan bills, I mean, it was amazing to see, Marco Rubio standing beside Kirsten Gillibrand. When has that happened? I mean, it's amazing. Campus violence isn't an issue that should be partisan, right? Does that answer your question? Or
this is the laugh draft I saw again. You never know. I'll look it up actually as soon as we're done with this to make sure.
So it's introduced, and then it goes to the HELP committee, which is Alexandra. So if that's anybody's senator, call them. And then so it'll go through a vetting process, and which some language might change. And then it really just depends on floor time after that.
And also one of the biggest things that doesn't actually get a lot of attention in the media is that it actually changes the statute of limitations for Title IX, which as of right now is 180 days since the last instance of harassment, which it could be like by the end of your sophomore year that you even know what your rights are. Whereas with the bill, it would be 180 days after disaffiliation with the university. So, I mean, you could have it up until graduation, after transferring. So it gives students a lot more opportunity to be able to hold their school accountable.
Very briefly, I know there's a lot of questions, but for those who don't know, just to explain a little bit, so if you think of the Department of Education as this huge umbrella, you have two laws primarily which address sexual assault. One is called the Clery Act, and under the Clery Act, schools are required to report crime data to the Department of Education. As you saw in the film, they underreport those numbers. That's a crime act, that's data. And then Title IX is about students' equitable right to an education. That's still under the Department of Education, but it's just a separate office. So students can file with the Clery Department or the Title IX office or both. Does that make sense? Okay. I just wanted to clarify because I know we're throwing around a lot of legal jargon.
And as a lawyer, I can tell you that you often want to throw as many claims as possible as long as they don't subject you to a Rule 11 sanction for having no absolute basis in law at all. But if you've got a couple laws to try, you want to try them both to see if you can get forward on one of them. So the audience question was an expression of outrage about some of the emails that our panelists received, and the question being whether the school did anything to offer any sort of protection or to address that at all.
Yeah, thank you for your question. We were actually at the White House 2 days ago, and there was a student who actually had a very similar case like ours with emails. And in her case, she was getting, there's an app called Yik Yak, and basically what it is these anonymous threats via this app. And the school said, well, it's freedom of speech, and we can't do anything about it. And that's very much what I received when I was like, I don't know what to do about these threats. I feel very unsafe. And I mean, as you can see in the film, like my dorm was broken into. I mean, I thought that was it. I thought that was enough evidence to prove that I was I was in danger. And, the police didn't do anything. There were fingerprints. I took the photos because they didn't take the photos. And it wasn't actually till a week later, after one of my residents wrote a letter to the editor, that the university thought to send an alert that there was a break-in at a dorm. So, I mean, we see that, even in that case where there was actual physical threat, I mean, the university didn't respond. And a lot of it is because, there's more of a deterrence for coming forward than there is for actually raping someone. So what we see is a lot of the survivors that come forward deal with this. And it's very much, part of the package of coming forward. And I think universities are very hesitant to actually, step up and help them because it is seen as more of a PR problem than anything else.
So the audience member expressed gratitude again to the panelists for participating, and then asked a question about, are we seeing any, for example, big donors at institutions putting some pressure on and saying, I'm not giving that big gift if I don't get seeing some of the numbers about the assault and seeing something being done about that, or perhaps parents conditioning sending their children to those institutions on being comforted by the numbers.
We have had alumni. And it's actually mostly been young alumni, and a lot of us don't have a lot of money to actually write back and try to hold our schools accountable. So yes, we are looking at those big name donors who, your names are on the buildings. We need more of that. There has been some effort there, but it needs to be more. And then the other thing is about the low numbers. So when you see 0 reports of sexual assault, as Andrea said earlier, I think that's a red flag, because it either means students aren't comfortable coming forward to your administration to report, or you are artificially somehow keeping your numbers low, whether that be by calling a count of rape or sexual assault sexual misconduct, or a sexual or non-consensual sex, or an infraction, so thereby you don't have to report it. Either way, your students aren't coming forward, or you're mislabeling them and your numbers are 0. That's statistically basically impossible. So that's a red flag. And until universities collectively start, or some university takes a leadership position and says, we actually do have these high numbers, nothing's going to change. So 0 is a red flag on that for parents.
And we've seen some mobilization at some campuses that have come under fire, in particular at Dartmouth, at Amherst. I mean, they have kind of come back up.
Occidental a little bit.
Yeah, and Occidental. I mean, you've seen some of the numbers drop in students that applied to the school, in particular after the school made headlines for sexual assault. So it has impacted. I think, again, everyone needs to go to college at some point, so there's never not going to be enough applicants. They're always going to get seats at somewhere. So I think it's important for us to continue holding schools accountable, because it's every school. I mean, every school I applied to is either on that list or will be at some point. And I think it's so important to continue that conversation.
So the question is, why aren't more of these just reported directly to the police off campus? Why don't these just go straight to being a crime?
Okay, so survivors have 2 broken systems to choose from, okay? And I think, just my own experience with reporting the break-in and the vandalism, literally nobody followed up with me. I tried. Multiple parents called the police. What is going on in this building? My students are feeling unsafe. I didn't even consider going to the police when it came to my assault, and that's mainly because I had heard from other students that it didn't go well with them, and I also didn't know who my assailant was. But I think, there's just so much that's deeply rooted as to why people don't go to the police. You can see some, just from some of the stories in the movie. Erica used both systems, and they both betrayed her.
So I think this is actually a really common question. I see a lot of head shaking, but it is a common question. So under federal law, the school has an obligation to deal with the situation, and a lot of times the criminal justice system can take years. And, some students just want to be students. They want somebody out of their chemistry class. They want to move residence halls. And they can't wait for a backlog of rape kits of 2 to 3 years to make that happen. And also, a lot of state statutes aren't all-encompassing of survivor narratives. And so you also have a criminal justice system that's, racist and heterosexist, which basically means, there's very narrow things in which you can prosecute. And, some types of rape don't count, right, in certain states. And so for some survivors, the only option they do have is the school system. And so I think what we would ideally want to have is 2 systems where survivors feel equally comfortable that they would have the prospect of receiving some sense of justice from both of them. And I think we need to leave it up to and this is just my personal opinion, this isn't the film, but leave it up to the survivor and trust the survivor to make the best choice, because one option might be better or worse depending on their situation of safety, of race, of documentation status, right? So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but it is a really common question, and I think we need to think about it.
And I think elaborating really quick on what Annie was saying, just to kind of give you the gravity of this problem, there are states in which men literally cannot be raped by the book. It does not count. And there are also some states, even if you're a female victim and the perpetrator is a male, if it's a certain type of penetration, it does not count. So it's just, there are literally states where you have no option in the criminal justice system. So I think it's also just important to see that there's a lot to go for this issue. One thing is fixing what's happening on campus. The next thing is actually fixing with how our society deals with sexual violence.
So the question is about, we saw in the film, some of the portrayal of fraternities. How are the sororities responding, embracing, reacting to this?
Yeah, so I think fraternities and sororities, and I think all of Greek life can be a very good group of people to mobilize awareness around this issue. But I mean, I have seen good and I have seen negative responses. And I mean, a good example of a negative response was just a front page article in the Daily Tar Heel, which is the University of North Carolina's paper, where a survivor from Delta, which is a very prominent sorority across the country, came forward about her experience and talked about how she was completely victim blamed by her chapter and, you know, told that she just wasn't making the right choices. And it's very hard for a Greek woman to come forward at many universities, mainly because, you know, the fraternity system is so entrenched in their own social life. And especially, I know at some schools like Dartmouth, for example, there were so many Greek women who told me that, you know, most of their chapter had been assaulted, and they just did not feel comfortable coming forward because of all the pressures on the campus. So I think I've seen some very positive ones too. I mean, there's some really prominent Greek life survivors at Berkeley, for example, that are very, very vocal in what's happening both in Greek life and the campus as a whole. But I also have seen the negative. And I think what we see in institutions is that there's a lot of potential there. And, you know, I just really hope that some of these chapters really step behind the issue as a whole and really support the survivors in their chapters and across campus.
So the young ladies in the front, the two young ladies in the front row are going to college this fall and have applied to some of the schools portrayed in the film, and they're asking for advice.
I would firstly say that the filmmakers could have chosen any colleges in the United States, and we would have seen the same response. Just because certain schools are under investigation doesn't mean their problem is better or worse. It just means somebody decided to call them out. And there's no campus that's really immune from this problem. It's hard because I want you to know what your rights are, but I would much rather speak to the men, you know, and say that this is a problem that they need to, you know, stop, right? And I also think, you know, we're here in California, but as someone who grew up in the South, we didn't talk about this. And if the first time we're hearing about sexual assault is at our college orientations, we're having this conversation way too late. And I think it needs to start, you know, elementary and middle and high school at age-appropriate levels, and we need to have this conversation before that because we know we have survivors entering into college already. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to have with you the same conversation I have with my little sister because she actually was applying to school the year I was raped. So she had to, you know, deal with me telling her for the first time and picking one of these schools and figuring out where she would feel safest at. And I think it's something that you're going to see as soon as you get to campus. You're going to feel very small as a little freshman, and everyone's going to tell you that you don't matter. And I think, you know...
Matter.
No, I'm just telling you because that's something that I feel every first-year student has to learn. I mean, the fact that they are an integral part of that campus and that you have a right to a safe education, you need to ask those hard questions. You shouldn't leave it up to the seniors to ask these questions, and you shouldn't wait, you know, till you're about to leave to be like, you know, I care about this place and I want to hold it accountable. So I think ask those hard questions too, and you know, defend your rights in education.
Like if you have a midterm and you feel unsafe walking to the library, even if nothing's happened, you're just trying to go to the library to study, and that feels unsafe to you, ask why.
And your rights are, you know, also controlled then by the institution, and so the rights mean they have responsibilities, and so your rights aren't just limited by you hoping that other people behave well on campus. The school has legal obligations, responsibilities to keep you safe, and so what I would say is when you ask that why question and figure out what, you know, then take that next step and report to the campus and make sure they address those feelings. Definitely. And the lack of safety that you feel. They have an obligation to do so. That is very important that we should make sure and address. Just, you know, in public schools and private schools there are different legal obligations, but all I would say, if it's a private school, don't give up and think there's no hope. Contact an attorney. They'll look into the fact-specific inquiry and try to figure out if there's still a way that we can use the Constitution even in the private school setting.
Well, just one quick thing. There's only a handful of schools in the country. Like you have a few military institutions and a very small select number of private schools who don't accept federal funding. So if your school accepts any sort of federal funding, that even means student scholarships, you have to abide by Title IX, even if your school is private.
So that's why we're saying it's a fact-specific inquiry. We just look to see is there money coming from the government, and if so, then you're probably going to be in good shape. So the question is about preventative measures and if there's anything that would have been done differently.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are definitely asking this question in a very wrong framework. And the reason I'm saying that is because it is not my job to protect myself from sexual assault. It is not anybody's job to protect themselves from sexual assault. It is our job to hold the people who do this accountable. And I think, this is a conversation we need to start changing. And I think it's just... Nobody in this room deserves to be sexually assaulted. And let me tell you, I did everything right. I had the whistle, I had the taser, I had the blue light right next door, I had the friends, I had the jeans, I had the sweater. I mean, I had everything they told me to do, and it still happened. And I think it's so important to change this conversation because it could happen to anyone. And I think it just scares me because we are not holding the people who do this accountable. We're not telling them, why did you rape that girl? Why do you get to share the degree with me after raping that girl? And I think it's the conversations we had in Washington that, again, over and over and over again, what about the false claims? What about that poor boy whose life is ruined? And I'm like, what about all my friends who didn't graduate? What about all the girls in my hall who literally don't go on dates anymore? What about that time I used to wear high heels and I don't do it anymore? And I think this isn't the right question. I think what I tell young women like you is that you have a right to be who you are. You shouldn't be asked these questions. You shouldn't have to change who you are just because you exist in this world. So that's all I have to say.
I don't know if I can add anything to that. I do think it's important to note, though, that sexual assault, rape, this is the only crime in which we blame the victim. Like, if you imagine, are you sure you were carjacked? Are you sure someone broke into your house? Like, why were you drinking wine at your kitchen table? Like, well, what were you doing wrong? And I think, like, that sort of seems, like, obvious and sort of ludicrous, but these are the types of questions survivors are asked. So I think if we sort of, look at this objectively, we're going to hopefully start to change the conversation and realize that, we have a right to exist in a safe space regardless of, what we do.
President Obama, any involvement in this effort? And then we're going back to...
Okay.
President Obama's involvement in this effort?
Yes. So the White House, back in, I believe it was April of last year, announced... January then April, announced an initiative called It's On Us, which is basically a campaign to get other people involved in this issue, talking about everything from bystander intervention, although that's not a silver bullet solution, but that's one piece of this. So he basically came on and said, I think, I remember him saying, survivors, we have your back. And that was a very pivotal moment. Even, arguably one of the most powerful men in the world, the president, saying that that he has the back of survivors. Even just that show was incredible. It was a first step, and we need to see a lot of concrete action come after that. But I think having, that PSA, that interruption, if anybody saw the Grammys, was absolutely amazing that the message came from the White House. So they have a campaign. They're working with a few other people in the White House. I won't go into all of that. But they have a task force, and they're making recommendations to the Department of Education and as well as Congress as to how to best, support survivors and help solve this problem.
How can the students hold the schools accountable?
Do what the students at Berkeley are doing. Okay, and the students at Columbia are doing. And I think it's just, we have Sophie here who can talk about that experience, but I think, you really have to be that shadow that goes to all the meetings and says, what are you doing? And, I learned that pretty early on, that they don't like that. And then they also schedule meetings when you're in classes. But I think it's so important for you to not declare victory when a task force is created, when somebody is hired, when maybe one rapist might be suspended and then comes back in the fall. It's so important to be thorough and to really demand that transparency. And it's hard to say when you're going to win because it's not going to be a long, You know, it's not going to be a quick victory, right? And it's important that you teach students that are younger than you to continue holding them accountable.
Yeah, I'll definitely say institutional memory is a problem because especially, you know, not only students graduate within 4 years, but those positions and student affairs and housing that interact with students most closely, they have very high turnover. So once those people leave, once the troublemakers, the whistleblowers leave, it's back to the old way. That's not to say there aren't great people on campus. I think this is an institutional problem and it needs to come from the top down, that leadership. But there are great people on campus, and that's how we've been able to do a lot of these things. You know, you find your one great police officer, your few good, you know, counselors, and recognize that there are good people. It's that the system overall is failing.
The entrenchment of alcohol and the role it plays with all this and what we're seeing and how to deal with that.
Yeah, alcohol is the number one, what they call date rape drug. So it's often a weapon used by perpetrators to get their victims intoxicated. And the term our producer often uses is target rape. So it's a very intentional thing. It's not this sloppy hookup, oops, I fell, something happened. It's a very intentional thing that's committed multiple times by serial perpetrators. That's not to say that we shouldn't have comprehensive alcohol education and teach our students how to drink if they choose to do so responsibly. But alcohol, I think, you know, it is definitely involved as a weapon, as a drug, but it's a red herring when it comes to blaming alcohol for rape, rapist rape. So
this happens on dry campuses, you know, and it just keeps happening. And I think it's important for us to change away from the framework of it being the date rape, you know, girl drank too much, doesn't know what's happening. And it be more about guy knows exactly what he's doing, he knows exactly who she is and how to get away with it.
So we are going to have to turn the theater now, I think, for the next screening. But let's just give a final.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
Let's just give a final thank you, and then we'll let them say any final thing. Well, say what you want to say first, and then we'll applaud you as people leave.
Just one more thing. Just because statistically, like we're in a theater, and there's more than 5 female-identified people, and there's lots of male-identified people in the room too. So that means we have survivors, and if you are a survivor, if you know a survivor, just that. It's not your fault, and you are not alone, and we believe you. Thanks.
And there are resources in the room for you
Yes.
tonight if you need to speak to someone. So let's thank Annie and Andrea for their bravery, for their courage, for being here with us tonight, for the film, Sophie, everyone else in the room, all the local people who do the work they're doing.